Morning, everyone. So today we're going to look at the underworld, the Egyptian underworld, and more importantly, the way they buried their dead and why they did it. They had a specific ritual. So this is the Egyptian rites of the dead and why they did it. So they did it because they believed in the afterlife. And obviously they have their great pyramids, but they didn't start with pyramids. That was something that came later. But there's a story there's a story behind why they did this, why they believed in the afterlife. So when a person had died, he was taken to the underworld, which was their afterlife, where what he had done in life was taken into account, where he had to basically, somebody in the afterlife looked at what he had done in his previous life, in his everyday life. And that was the court of Osiris for final judgment. So like the gates of heaven. It was a place, this place was called the Island of Fire. And it's quite obvious that the Egyptians had knowledge about burning the interior of Earth, though they had no volcanoes in their own country. Egypt doesn't have them. Before coming for there, the dead person had to pass a labyrinth of gates, like a maze of gates and doors, and answer questions correctly to pass through. So they had different gods and goddesses lined up through the underworld and the afterlife that the person that had just died, that they had to pass through. That's what the Egyptians believed, almost like a test of the person's soul and how they had performed in life. And that's what the ritual that happened to the body went through to get them successfully through the afterlife on their journey. So there was a lion god, Akka, let the person who just died through the last gate, and here he was facing 14 members of a jury in a tribunal hall, and there he was allowed to speak about his behaviour on earth when he had been alive. Then the god Anubis would take him into a courtroom and present him the scale where his heart would be, and it would be put into a balance with a feather of the goddess Ma'at, and she was the patroness of truth and harmony. And the procedure was recorded by the god Thoth, and he was the god of writing and wisdom. And sometime Thoth's animal, which was represented as a baboon, would be sitting on top of the scale, ready to adjust the result using a sliding scale. If the heart of the person who died wasn't too heavy from his sins or her sins of life on earth, he went through, and he could continue his voyage through the gate through the gate, and he could continue on his journey to the afterlife, and he was granted a plot of land in the field of reeds. And that was paradise for the ancient Egyptians. So that would be like our going through the gates of heaven. And there he could grow she could grow crops for eternity in a land that was the very image of the Nile Valley that they'd just left. So heaven on earth. But if they failed the test on anything, then their heart was immediately eaten by the beast Amut, who would be sitting under the scale, ready to have a good eat. And in that case, the dead person faced the most horrible future imaginable. They were denied an eternal life in the land in the west, and the soul remained restless forever. So there were 7 steps that they had to go through to get to the field of reeds. The first step was they had to cross the celestial river by Nempti to the land in the west. The second was to pass through gates and labyrinths by answering questions. The third, they had to be let into the great court of the underworld by the god Akka. They had to address a jury of 14 judges about the deeds during their life on earth. They would be taken by Anubis to the balance of truth to weigh their heart of its sins. If the heart wasn't heavy, they would be brought by Horus to the chief judge Osiris. And only then, they could enter the field of reeds, which was paradise, and get eternal life. And we know all of this because of the Book of the Dead. Now, in most versions of the Book of the Dead, it was an illustrated manuscript. That means it's a drawing consisting of hundreds of hieroglyphs and drawings, and it consisted of prayers and magical texts to be used during the funeral ceremony and read over the dead to ensure the survival into the afterlife. It was a necessary part of the funeral equipment, and it was thought to help the person travel through the journey into the underworld. There were 150 burial spells written on papyrus and papyri papers and placed with the dead bodies, traced back to the Old Kingdom pyramid texts of 2300 BC. And it's thought that they existed long before they were written down. Each province and towns had their own version of these texts, mentioning local gods that they preferred over and above the bigger gods for the whole of the region. For poor people, so for the average Egyptian man and woman, the versions of these texts weren't so elaborate, and the Book of the Dead weren't so elaborate as the ones for the kings and queens and also the noble men and women. But every single person that was buried had a Book of the Dead that accompanied them in the tombs. But every single book, part of it contained a massive section when they came in front of the jury in the underworld. And the writings all had a sort of confession of the person that was in the book, in the tomb, where they would make confessions like, I have not killed, or I have not used false weights against my balance, which would be the balance of their heart. I have not caused pain to anyone. And then they would state things like, I used to give my clothes to poor people when I saw them, water to the thirsty, bread to the hungry. And that was to convince the people that they were going to be seeing in the afterlife, those jury members, that they genuinely believed they were going to be seeing, that they were kind, benevolent, generous people and had been on earth. One of the spells was spoken in front of a tribunal of 42 gods before they even got to their 14 jury members, and it proclaimed the innocence of a series of specified sins that covered every kind of wrongdoing. So that's like our 7 commandments. And this made the soul worthy to go further into the judgment hall, where the court of Osiris had the final word. Being approved of there, he was ready to embark on the boat of Re to sail to the land in the west for eternal rest. The purpose of embalming a body, the ka and ba, so the body and soul were considered 2 different things. Your body was considered ka, K-A, and your soul was known as ba, B-A. And the Egyptians considered them 2 separate things, so ka and ba. And you had to preserve the body through embalming. But together they built up the body, a person's personality. So the physical body was essential for existence and an eternal life for the deceased, for the dead person. The Egyptians believed that every person during life and after was followed by an invisible double called Ka. He was created at the moment of birth and stood for the force of life for the person. He could not be seen or depicted, but all tombs had a blind door for him to use. And after death, a transformation or rebirth took place, and every night he was released to give his dead master a spiritual travel to the land of the living. The travel itself was made by his soul, Ba, and this link from the tomb to life on earth that was supposed to go on forever. But commoners couldn't afford embalming, and they were offered simple statuettes of mummies to give their Ka someone to stand beside in the life beyond, and thereby please their lifelong companion and get eternal rest for themselves. The human soul was called Ba and was depicted as a bird with a human face, sometimes with the features of the dead person, The Ba, like Ka, appeared for the first time at the moment of birth, but the Ba was dwelling within the body and after death in the mummy. During life, he was his master's conscience, and after death, he was protected from being misled by evil spirits through rituals and prayers from the Book of the Dead, performed by priests and relatives. And correct behaviour in both worlds was essential to the Egyptians. After death, he was released from the mummy every night and could fly back to the world of the living to check things out. But before sunrise, he had to be back with his master, so he could never lose contact with the world he'd just left. So the burial customs. The purpose of a burial custom was to ensure the dead person a successful passage into the next world. Tombs from the very beginning were shallow holes in the sand, later to be lined with a wall of sun-dried bricks or stones and topped by a mound of sand or clay. The structures were downwards with pits leading to grave chambers cut out into the bedrock. Started around 3,200 years ago. The structures above ground developed into bench-like brick buildings, later to be made of stone and ending with great pyramids, a time span of evolution for almost half a millennium. The amount of grave goods and offerings was increasing and became more sophisticated, as seen in the treatment of the body of the deceased. The first custom of mummification appears in about 3,200 BC and steadily progressed in technicality so that they became better at mummifying the bodies for 2,000 years. From simple dehydration made by the dry climate, so they learned how to use the chemicals that they could get their hands on properly over 1,000 years. Originally, the dead were placed in a crunched position lying on their side, but with time, traditions changed and they were stretched out on their backs. So originally, they were placed almost curled up on their sides, but then over time, they lay them flat on their backs. Their religion believed that the body should be preserved intact for the soul to dwell within the next world. Kings and royalties hid their dead, protected under mountains of stone, and later in hideouts in the deserts. Unfortunately, huge monuments drew attention to the poor people, and Egyptians never separated the valuable offerings and grave goods from the mummies, so robbers obviously robbed the graves during periods of political instability. Great kings from the Old Kingdom did not come to the Field of Reeds after death because, obviously, if you followed the ritual for the Field of Reeds, some of the kings didn't behave in a proper manner, and so their heart would have weighed heavy on the scales, so they would not have been allowed to cross into the Field of Reeds. And so they tried to protect themselves under mountains of stone, which is why the pyramids were so big, which drew attention to everybody, which is why the tombs got raided. The next world was located in more than one place, both in a physical and a religious sense. It could be in an area under the tomb, it could be among the stars, in the celestial regions of a sun god, or in the underworld itself. All the places had one thing in common, though. They were all located in the west, where the day and life ended with the setting of the sun. Because the journey was set with obstacles to the underworld, it was a trip by a boat, through many gates with tricky questions to answer. The judgment after death was a subject often depicted from the New Kingdom and onwards. The belief itself was much older, and so this is why pyramids face the way they do, why the tombs inside the pyramids are organised the way that they are with all of their chambers. They all point to the west, because the Field of Reeds was in the beautiful west. So if the heart weighed heavy, the bodies still faced west. That's a clever idea. I didn't know that until I've just read that. Most of them, the kings, could pass by giving offerings to the gods and making declarations about their good behaviour on earth, whether this was true or not, but their bodies were lying west anyway. And that is the ritual of the burial customs. Now, today is Friday and next week is half term, so I will be here in a week's time, and I hope you have some lovely time away off. Hopefully it's going to stay sunny for the week of half term, and we can all enjoy some well-earned time away from screens and get out in the garden a bit more. I'll see you in a week's time. Bye-bye.